Hello, everyone. We're continuing our series of discussion, Get Real, and about housing and new forms of coexistence. Today is our fifth meeting and fifth conversations. And we are curatorial collective talk, originally from St. Petersburg, but now working internationally. We are a nomadic institution as a platform for project and in the intersection of contemporary art, social science, and socially oriented design. Our multi-layered, durational, and cross-disciplinary project are conducted in order to generate new knowledge about the cause and consequences of changing political realities. And one of our ongoing projects, Critical Mass, and the series of discussion Get Real, the fifth season, which we're working on now, is focused on the question of housing and different forms of cohabitation and co-living.
The online series is a way to kind of take the housing question out of its disciplinary isolation by placing knowledge about it in an artistic context. So we invite artists, curators, sociologists, architects, historians, anthropologists to join in this series of conversations where we all together kind of try to talk about new formats and artistic and research methods for cross-disciplinary and decolonial analysis of the topic of housing policy. So we, for instance, zoom into both well-known and underrepresented historical and contemporary cases of social and political discrimination of people and entire communities, be it through systematic deprivation of housing or land grabbing. We also analyze some collective rethinking tactics and strategies of organizing living spaces, of kind of new cohabitation formats. And we look at architecture and the architectural paradigms using the optics of gender studies, feminism, and sexuality. And today we're very happy to host Efrat, Dr. Efrat, architect and architectural historian. He is a partner at Efrat Architects. He was a head of the Department of Architecture at the Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design in Jerusalem. He holds BA in Architecture from Pratt Institute, MA in Cinema Studies, and PhD in Architectural History and Theory from Princeton University. Zvi has taught and lectured worldwide. He also published extensively and curated numerous exhibitions. And he is an author of two books on Israeli architecture. One of them is called The Israeli Project, Building and Architecture, 1948-1973, which was published in 2004 by Tel Aviv Museum of Art. And his most recent book is called The Object of Zionism, the Architecture of Israel, published by Spectre Books in 2018. And today we will speak about the Israeli housing project, its political implications, its political aftermath, the planning behind it, the politics and ideology behind planning the architecture of the state of Israel, how it was developing, what are the roots of it. We'll compare it also to maybe some other similar architectural and political big, large-scale projects, and see if ideologically and politically it could also be compared to such maybe project as the development and the construction boom of the Soviet Union, or other global projects that were kind of aimed at rapid increase of housing and expansion of territories. So Zvi, the floor is yours, and please start.
Thank you very much, Anna and Maria, for inviting me today. It's very ambitious to try to tell a very rich, dense, and complex story in such a short time. So if I'm not successful doing that, I hope that after my presentation and my talk, we'll get some questions and I can further clarify things that come up during the lecture. Yeah, okay. First of all, let me try to share with you. Okay. I would like to begin with a series of funny and quite pastoral images. We begin with these people dancing in the fields, or images like that. For the Russians among you, maybe it looks a bit familiar. I don't know, something in the atmosphere. The songs, by the way, that they sing are probably Russian songs with the Hebrew wording. These are groups of mostly young, what they call themselves as pioneers. They constitute the first stages of the Jewish national movement. The point being, for me, in showing you these images, this set of images, is that if I have to really to give you the bottom line of what it is in its own mind, I'm talking about the Jewish national movement or the Zionist movement, what it is in its own mind, or if I can borrow the term that was mentioned before, what is the political and ideological imaginary of this movement, of these people? It is in its own mind a reform movement. It is, first of all, a social reform movement, but just as well an environmental reform movement. And as such, this is a concert in a quarry, for example. This is, by the way, the second on the left is myself as a child, okay, in a kibbutz. What Zionism is in its own mind is a reform movement, and quite specifically, an anti-urban reform movement. So it is a rural reform, okay? But unlike what we know about the rural, and here it's a bit similar to the Russian kolkhoz and so on, but also not at all like it, because here it's the avant-garde. It's the intellectual, political, cultural elite that would go to the rural and would establish a new kind of ruralism or a new kind of rural life, which will be based, first of all, on certain political, social, and cultural ideas. So it's a very sort of radical movement. It's not everybody, as I will show you later. There's also the bourgeois part, which is always the main part. This is a smaller part, but this is sort of the avant-garde, the elite. And what we see here, for example, in this poster, which is kind of a common poster, again, looks a bit like a Russian constructivist poster or something like that. It says, the labor union calls you to go from the city to the village. You see the arm and the house in the village, and you see this dark city guy figure. So we have to go from the city, which is the source of all troubles, to the fields, to the open, to where we can have healthier and more just social life. This is one thing that it's very important to understand. It's officially, at least, and certainly politically, rhetorically, it's against the city and towards the village, the countryside, the rural, and not just going to the rural as it is, because there is the rural, and here is the difficulty to maybe to understand, to comprehend. Unlike the old world, unlike Europe, here the rural has to be invented. It has to be fabricated. in their own mind, it doesn't exist. What exists is, in fact, the native, the indigenous Palestinian rule, or the Arab rule. But this is exactly what they don't want to see, or they want to erase. What they want to do is to create a new rule, and a highly modernist rule. The word modernist is extremely important. You say Zionism, it's immediately and totally a modernist movement. It's one of the most radically modernist movements of the 20th century. You will not find almost anything that you can call Zionist that is not, first of all, modernist. It's a big question how we define, of course, a modernist, but you will see, at least architecturally, I don't know how many of you are architects or coming from an architectural education, but as I will show now, what we see with the early decades of Zionism, and now we're talking about the 20s and 30s of the 20th century, what we see is one of the most innovative periods in architectural history, where new types of settlements and new types of buildings are constantly invented, and they're all modernist. They're all according to the modernist paradigm, whatever it means. Modernist could be Russian constructivism, it could be Bauhaus, it could be Dutch modernism, it could be many things, or Le Corbusier, but it's always modernist. It will never be a traditional. So it's a back to the land movement, but it's not a conservative back to the land movement. It's, in fact, it's a revolutionary in its own mind, or radical, or almost utopian rural movement. Okay, so we see here, for example, I'm just showing it to you quickly, new types of settlements that were not only invented but also built. So what I show you here, these are all kinds of different kinds of rural settlements, mostly communal or communes. Okay, this is what we call kibbutzim, but not only, there are different kinds of collectivist or communal settlements. So there's always a social idea, and then the social idea gets an architectural form, an architectural translation. Because it's a new invention, I cannot get deeper in details to describe you what kind of social contract they invent, but each one of them has a different social contract. It's always there. For example, it's only based on self-labor. You work according to your abilities and consume according to your needs, and so on. And there's no place for any property. You don't own anything privately. There's no sense of privacy or privately owned things. It's all owned or shared communally. So all the spaces are shared. There's no room. There's no house here. The entire settlement is the house. So all the activities take place communally. It's very important architecturally, because then you have to build buildings for the entire community to gather, to eat together, for example. Okay, you don't have a kitchen, you don't eat at home because you don't have a home. So obviously you don't have a kitchen, and your children do not live at home with you. They live in a children's society, and so on and so forth. But each of them has a slightly different kind of social contract, and therefore each one of them has a different kind of architecture. And hence, each one needs an architect. So there is always an architect behind it. So Zionism, and this is more than any other modernist, national, or any other movement that I know, Zionism always has an architect, or a whole army of architects and engineers and social engineers, sociologues, and agronomers and gardeners and so on. You need all these professionals to enable you to invent, to fabricate these new kinds of human settlements or new kinds of civilizations. Okay. On the other hand, it's true that there's always a top-down design. Always, everything is designed. Every plant, is planted according to a certain design. Okay, there's nothing natural there. Okay, it's all artificial. But on the other hand, interestingly enough, in my opinion, there's always also a bottom-up participation of the entire community. Until today, if you go to a kibbutz, like this kibbutz that we look now at, Kibbutz Yagur, the bottom of the Carmel Mountains, it's a beautiful place. You go, you talk to the people, you know, elderly people, children, and so on. They all can talk to you about the architecture of the kibbutz. They're all kind of connoisseurs of the design of the space. You know, if you go in the city to people and ask them about their street or their building, they can tell you very little about it, why it was designed in this way. If you go to a kibbutz, they're all involved. Why? Because the entire community is part of this process. So interestingly, we have both always architects or top-down designers, but also always the entire community is involved, and therefore each one of these settlements, even if they share the same kind of principles, they all look slightly different, of course, because of the context, the topography, and so on, the climate, but also because the people are involved in this process. Okay, I have to go faster now, just to show you. So the entire the architecture is a sort of a setting for a very intense social life, and the buildings and the open spaces, they all have to contain this entire community. This is where they dine, for example, every day, or they do what they do, their exercises, the school, and so on. Yes, some of them were Stalinists, not all of them, but some. There was big mourning in Israel when the day Stalin died in some of these kibbutzim. Okay, and the architecture, as I said before, is extremely modernist. Now, this is very unusual in a rural setting. Usually, rural setting, it's I would say architecture without architects. Okay, there is this kind of this traditional building types that people build, you know, a long time, and there's very slow change of a certain style or typology. And here, again, since it's an invented ruralism and invented villages, so they have also to invent the new buildings with large spans, like dining halls, for example, here that we see, or this kind of buildings, they all look extremely modernist. And also, this is a very interesting moment because we're talking about immigrants who are coming from different places, from different climates, and they have to adapt to a very, very different situation, very different climate. So they have to quickly accommodate, learn the place, accommodate, and invent new kinds of buildings that could be well shaded and easily ventilated, because we're talking about a period when architecture is still passive, right? It's not, we don't have air conditioners and so on. So the architecture itself has to be very smart in order to enable life. So for example, this is a school classroom in a very hot area. So you see that the rooftop is all open and ventilated and well shaded. And all these kind of buildings, this is not the kind of architecture that we would normally see in a rural setting, but this is exactly what characterizes the Zionist project in its early stages. Okay, you see here another dining room, and you see the entire community. It's almost like a big ocean liner, right? The building, the dining hall, where the people are gathering on it and around it. Another dining hall in Kibbutz and Harod and so on. Okay. So much so that one of the main architects of this period, a Bauhaus graduate called Aryeh Sharon, was a disciple of Hannes Meyer, if the names means anything to you. And he was a major, kind of very famous student at Bauhaus, and he comes back to pre-state Israel, to Palestine, and he's involved in rural settlements in kibbutzim, but also in some urban socialist architecture in Tel Aviv, in other places. And he writes later on, in retrospect, this autobiography, which is called Kibbutz plus Bauhaus. Just to say these two big emblems, kibbutz, kind of the social avant-garde, or the social radicalism, and Bauhaus, the architectural avant-garde. These two notions really mean that, or they say a lot about the spirit of the time, but it's not only in the rural that we see highly modernist architecture. but also in the city, or mainly in the city, the new town of Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is also, of course, a new invention. Tel Aviv is just a town of Jews who were living within the walled city of Jaffa and getting out and beginning to build neighborhoods outside of Jaffa, and the city evolves again in the early decades of the 20th century. Of course, again, a city of immigrants, built almost entirely on modernist principles, at least the buildings. So we see this kind of architecture suddenly in the Levant. Okay. Again, I don't have enough time to explain why is it that the Jewish national movement adapts to such an extent this kind of modernist language, or I would say even modernist ideas and values. Okay, maybe we'll have time later in the discussion to further explain it. But just that you get an impression of what it is. These are images of Tel Aviv in the 30s. This is so now we're talking about, now it's not anymore rural socialist or communal architecture. Now it's an urban bourgeois kind of middle class architecture. And the buildings all look like that. It's in fact, I would say that it's a mishmash of different modernist styles and different modernist influences. It's almost a kind of a modernist gibberish, but it's all modernist. Okay, you cannot be mistaken about that. Really beautiful buildings, and a lot of these 5 points of the new architecture of Le Corbusier, the rooftop, the raising of the building on pilotis, the horizontal windows, always horizontal, right? This is one of the signs of this architecture. The free plan and the free facade, all these are applied, but on an urban scale, okay? Not on villas, but on urban scale, urban buildings. Like that, they're all different. They're all kind of a collage of different ideas, but they're all kind of, in my opinion, beautiful just because they're built and used by the people. So what's interesting here is really the quantity, because the quantity means that this was the desired kind of architecture of the time, both by the authorities and by the people themselves who are building these buildings. And this is, for me, it's quite amazing. I don't know, Jews, especially Eastern European Jews, are not known for their very good taste, very refined taste. And suddenly, in the 30s, there's a move from something more eclectic to this kind of very pristine modernist style. The question is, of course, why? Okay, but just that you know that it happens. So this is what we see. And there are also, within the bourgeois city of Tel Aviv, there are also certain enclaves of workers' housing, workers' cooperative housing. And they were called a kibbutz within the cities, because they were kind of communal or collectivist communities within the cities. I show you this because, mainly because this kind of housing estates will be the beginning of what we will see later after statehood as the horizontal public housing, the typical kind of public housing of the state of Israel, which I'm coming to very, very soon. Okay, but what we see here is really, you see the internal kind of courtyards, which is communal. Here also they had some communal dining rooms for the residents of these housing blocks and so on. So there were some features that they brought from the communal architecture of the rural to the city. Okay, now 1948. I do it very quickly. It's a very brief kind of very abbreviated history of architectural history of the Zionist movement. 1948, several years after the end of the Second World War, the state of Israel is established. We gain what we call our independence, our independent state. The British mandate is over. And for the Palestinians, it's the end, the aftermath of the war between the the Jewish movement and the Palestinian one, the results, the establishment of the state is what the Palestinians call the Nakba, or the disaster. And a disaster it is indeed. Before we continue, I'm not going to dwell on it today, but just that we understand that everything that we are going to see here, all these amazing new towns and housing projects that I'm going to show you now, is of course not only a building project, but also a project of erasure, a project that erases hundreds of Palestinian villages and towns, or parts of towns. Most of the existing landscape, built landscape, and natural agrarian Palestinian landscape are destroyed during and after the war, and in its stead, the state of Israel, or what I call the Israeli project, is built. Now I'm going to say something very important. This is the most important thing that I'm going to say today, and it sounds very simple, maybe too simple, but it's extremely important and not that obvious. Okay, what I'm going to say simply is that the state of Israel is a design. It is planned, as you can see in this amazing image of the book, the same Ariel Sharon that I told you from the Bauhaus and Hannes Meyer and so on, and it's called The Planning of Israel. Now, I don't think that there is any book, I know the planning of Russia or the planning of the Netherlands and the planning of Greece or whatever. And well, maybe you can have a book, but the point is not the book. The point is really that there is a master plan. Already 2 years after the establishment of the state in 1950, a master plan is produced. The head of the team of planners and architects is Ariel Sharon. He's basically the court architect of Ben-Gurion, who is the prime minister, the leader of the state. And his team is producing this master plan, or this book. It's called The Planning of Israel. And there, what we see is something quite amazing. It's a proposal to design an entire state. And remember, this is in 1950, so even the borders are not yet fixed. So the situation is still, territorially speaking, it's still not clear, but already there is an overall plan for the design of the entire state. Now, this plan has basically one principle that you have see above. It's called laissez-faire, or Tiknun in Hebrew, which is planning. So there are only two options. One is planning and one is not planning, just the scenario of business as usual. And of course, the scenario of laissez-faire is a disaster. It's like the doomsday. You see it on the left side, 80% of the people will live in one area along the shoreline, and this will be a disaster. This will be the end of the Jewish people, okay? And it's very easy to attack, and the entire territory is empty, right? So the entire idea is planning. Why planning? Because you have to disperse, to spread the population, okay? Somehow evenly across the entire land. Why to do it? Okay, one is ideological reason. Remember that Zionism in general, and now the state of Israel also, okay, always prefers the rural on the urban. Again, maybe later on I explain further why, okay? Has to do with many issues, also psychological, with the diasporic condition of the Jews in Europe and so on, so, and their inability to own lands and to work the land and so on. But the idea of being rooted in the land has to do with agriculture, first of all, and with the rural. So first of all, there is an ideological reason. We don't want to be urbanites, we want to be rural. So we have to spread. This is one idea. And of course, the other reason is strategic, because we have to occupy the land. And the best way to occupy the land is not through the military, but through civilian occupation. So you have to establish as many outposts, as many rural settlements as possible. So they should be always small or medium sized, not large. It's not effective, because you want to have them as many as possible and as spread as possible. Okay. So this is the main idea of this plan. Okay. But in order in order to materialize this idea, this plan, what do you have to do? You have to build new settlements. How many? Well, in the first decade, the 50s and maybe let's say 50s and 60s, about 400 new rural settlements are established by the state of Israel, and about 30 new towns. Okay, I don't remember how many new towns Stalin has built, but relatively speaking, for such a small place like Israel, it's really a very small place and a very small population. In 1948, we were talking about only about a little bit more than 500,000 Jewish people. And in the 60s, it's 2.5 million. It's really very small numbers. Even big cities in Europe or in Russia are not that size. I mean, it's really small. So 30 new towns, it's a huge number. And when I say new, I mean totally new, from scratch. You really have to invent these new towns. But I said already, remember that Zionism had already several decades of experience with inventing new types of settlements. So this is a kind of a Zionist habit, okay, to design every new architecture, every new urbanism. We already have a team of architects who are very experienced in this. And now we have a new generation of Israeli-born architects who are willing to continue this. This is amazing. If we have architects in the audience, you all know, we love to invent new worlds, new settlements, and new building types. And this is what's happening. There is, during the 50s and 60s, a crazy, frantic race to build new settlements and new towns. All this to say is that almost the same number, 400 rural settlements, is the number of Palestinian villages that were destroyed during this process. Okay, so there is the process of destruction and there is the process of building, and building it in such a way that it has nothing to do with the former condition of the land or the landscape or the existing, the traditional settlements that were already there. Okay. So this is, for example, one of the posters from this book, which was also an exhibition, by the way, which is amazing. This is also, I think, Russian habit. You're not only doing kind of things politically or kind of things on ground you build, but you also announce it or you do propaganda for your project. So there are always exhibitions. There are always ways to convince the people that what we are doing is just and great and so on. So there was in 1950 an exhibition explaining the people, of course, the Jewish people, what the government is doing and why. Okay, and of course, trying to convince them to move from the cities to the periphery, as I showed you this poster, from the city to the village. Always this one direction. And there was some kind of a regional scheme for all this. The idea was that you see these 6 small kind of round shapes. These are villages. So every 6 villages are around a village, a bigger settlement, which is the center for these villages. Every 6 centers like that are around a small town, which I'll show you in a second, these towns. So there was a scheme, a certain scheme, which was borrowed from some European planners, but the hexagon, the 6, the arrangement of 6 was kind of a typical planning scheme, even before. Okay. Anyway, one of the challenges was, of course, there were waves. Why it was possible, all this project? It was possible because there were waves of immigrants coming. First of all, survivors from the war in Europe, but also a lot of Jews who were coming or brought from other countries, mainly from North African countries and from Middle Eastern countries like Iraq and Yemen and so on. So there was basically kind of an ingathering of Jews from all over who were coming. So basically, within a span of a few years, the Jewish population is growing from more or less 500,000 or 600,000 to 2.5 and later on 3 million people. This is huge growth. And for a while, for the first years, of course, they were housed in temporary camps. So a lot of these people who were coming from camps in Europe, they were survivors of the camps in Europe. They were coming and first of all were housed in these kind of temporary camps. These temporary camps oftentimes were the infrastructure or the foundation for later on permanent settlements that were built on these sites. Okay, so you see some of these camps, really very poor, basic shacks. But soon enough, I don't know if you can see, on the left, you can see the camp, and on the mountain, you can already see the new town is being built. So there was this move from temporary to permanent housing. And I would say that within what I call the Israeli project, the centerpiece is housing. The main pride of the state is its ability to house within about a decade the entire population in permanent housing, decent permanent housing with running water and electricity. This is actually quite a lot at that time. And this was quite, from my own perspective, from an architecture perspective, quite an heroic project. And a lot of, even if it looks very, sometimes very banal, as you will see, or standard or basic, actually it's a very fine architectural project, and the best of the local architects were participating in this effort to rapidly build all these accommodations for all the people coming to Israel. Now the cities themselves, again, we don't have much time to explain it, but just briefly, were built on a certain concept of garden cities. It's not the garden cities of the Ebenezer Howard of the early 20th century, but it's the kind of post-war British Abercrombie garden cities. All I can say here is look at the biomorphic shapes. See these beautiful organic shapes? It has nothing to do with topography or with any other reason. It's just a whim, okay? It's just a gesture. It's just kind of a copy paste of a type that was invented in the new towns around London and so on, and were brought to very different conditions, sometimes, like in this case of the city of Beersheba, sometimes in a desert condition, so there's nothing green about it. It's just watercolors that were green, but in reality, these places were not at all anything like the conditions in Europe or in Great Britain, but nevertheless, they were built like that. My point is, for this specific lecture, is that just notice the discrepancy between the kind of these beautiful paintings, okay, these beautiful kind of organic shapes, and what you will see in a second as the housing blocks, okay, which are exactly the contrary of this kind of free forms, okay. So the forms were always they were called eggs or amoebas and so on. And by the way, what you see in brown and what is more rational, almost greed, you see on the right side, and also you saw it in the previous image here, you know, this was the former Arab town, in this case, the former Arab town of Majdal. So it was now completely ruined, totally ignored, and next to it, look how different, what kind of an effort they go to build something completely different. Not at all connected to the former one. Here, the Arab town is in the center, but look around it, they don't build at all, only these kind of amoebas around it, okay? And with a bit close up on one of these shapes, if we look closer, again, we see these organic, these amorphic forms, and inside we begin to see these horizontal housing blocks. Now, my point is this. What we see here is a very strange kind of urban concept. It's an urban concept that is based on the idea of separation rather than integration, or what we call professionally of zoning. We separate. This is part of the idea of kind of environmental reform. So, you know, it's a discourse against the big city, against the industrial city. So in industry, it's not healthy, it's polluting, and so on, it's noisy, so we have to separate it. And commerce, it's a problem, so we have to separate it. And education, we have to separate it. And the cars from the pedestrians, we have to separate. You know, nowadays, when we think on good urbanism, of course, we think exactly the opposite on mixed use. In fact, throughout history, we always thought that this is the basic idea of a city. But here, it's a new kind of city. Again, it's an invention of a new kind of city that is based on separation rather than integration. And especially what we see here is that they're trying to create a city while getting rid of the idea of the street. Because the street is maybe a kind of stupid idea, but it's a very effective one, right? What is the street? The street is basically this horizontal conduit where you have all the uses combined. You have on the ground floor usually a commercial activity or public activity. You have on top housing and probably also work possibilities and so on. Everything is integrated somehow within the street. And of course, you have all the mechanical transportation and pedestrian somehow managing together, sharing the same space. And here, what we see is exactly the opposite. We have a city that has no notion of a street. It's basically just neighborhoods, or they call it neighboring units. And each neighborhood has a center which this is where you go to buy your grocery, and this is where you have the kindergarten or the medical facilities and so on. So it's a very comfortable city because you have everything that you need, and children do not have to cross roads, so it's not dangerous, and it's all surrounded supposedly by greenery, but it's not a city. Okay, this is exhibition. Again, trying to sell the people these ideas, the idea of the new towns. Again, you see the horizontal housing blocks here. A lot of these exhibitions, I'm just going very quickly through this, just so that you have an idea that it was not only kind of an emergency, because in Israel, many people think that, well, they had no time, no money, it was after the war, they did what they could. No, on the contrary, it's a very conscious project. And rhetorically, they were working very hard to explain to people what they're doing. I wish that today somebody will take this effort to share the public with all this information. A lot of exhibitions about this kind of housing projects, but the building blocks themselves were extremely simplified, always horizontal, no more than 3 stories, up to 4 stories. One of the reasons being that above 4 stories, you need an elevator, which is expensive, so you save money on the horizontal. And we talk a bit more about horizontality in a second. You see these images, you can find hundreds of these images because all these new towns, all these 30 new towns are based on this kind of landscape of horizontal, parallel or not, housing blocks that all look more or less similar. Now, this kind of similarity or generic appeal is important, of course, because this is part of the idea of solidarity and supposedly equality. It was not at all like that, but at least it looks like that, okay? And why solidarity? Because it's part of this rhetoric of the melting pot. So the state or the housing project is the melting pot of all these people who are coming from different cultures and immigrating from different cultures, from different backgrounds, different means, and they all get the same, okay, supposedly, and they all live in the same kind of even environments. So even people who live in the last apartment, if you look carefully, you see that the short elevation, the side elevation, you see that it's blind, it has no windows. So people who live in the corner apartments, they don't have an advantage. They don't have more. Okay, they don't have more what we call airside, or more windows. So we see a lot of them, and what's amazing in these images is that, as if there's no context, as if they don't care about the landscape, about the topography, about the climate. This is kind of one of the most beautiful places in Eilat, and you see still that you see the same kind of rationale, the same kind of arbitrariness in the layout of these buildings. Now, I have to say this, just to be fair. There is a lot of know-how and expertise and commitment in the design of these buildings, especially in the design of these apartments, because these are very small apartments. These are usually, I would say, between 30 to 50 square meters apartments. The 50 square meters apartments would be a kind of a luxury apartments. And these apartments should fit families, sometimes even big families. And they are again, passive apartments, so there's no air conditioning. And in this climate, you need very good ventilation and shading in order for these apartments to be livable. And again, there was, of course, a kitchen and running water, so what we call the wet part of the apartments. So it's very difficult. For example, with my students nowadays, if I want them to be really good, I challenge them to design such small apartments that are good apartments and livable and so on. But this is on the scale of the apartment, or of the architectural design of the object, the internal design. But if we look, and also, by the way, the reproduction also takes some skill, because we need it to be cheap, reproducible. So the details must be very, very sturdy, very durable, and very wise. So architecturally, there is a lot of quality here. But if we look at the the layout, or the urban layout, it's totally arbitrary. There is no way that we can justify this kind of layouts. And if we look again and again, this is in the desert. Totally, it's like an out of space kind of creatures that landed there, or this beautiful landscape with the Galilee in the north. And I chose this image for the poster because this is really, for me, it says it all. You see there, it's kind of a beautiful topography. Of course, this is a model, but it was also built like that. By the way, if I was not clear enough about the Israeli project, and what I said, that there are very few countries or national projects ambitious enough to design the entire land, I didn't say maybe the most important thing. And this is, there's none that was not only ambitious enough to design the entire state, but was actually trying and succeeding in implementing this plan and building it in situ as it was designed. So all these crazy plans were actually built. So the entire state, I would say in 2 decades, was fabricated, including everything, all these new towns, all these villages, all these infrastructures, all the landscape, all the parks, all the airports, the nuclear reactors, what have you, all the industry, everything. Everything was designed according to this plan in these what we call formative decades of the 50s and 60s. And here in this image, we see, that really not even, the north-south sides matter here. Sometimes you see that architects really cared because the best long elevations would be to the south and to the north in Israel. Here, they don't care. It could be anything, it could be anything. The views here, it's above, it's in Mitzpe Ramon, it's above a huge crater. It's one of the most beautiful landscapes, maybe, I don't know, anywhere. And they don't care, people don't get to see the landscape. And so there is just a pattern which is totally arbitrary. And we see it in many places. Here we see the same model now is being built on site with prefabricated elements. And we see here, this is another place, but we see here how arbitrary it is. First of all, we see that the buildings are almost before any kind of infrastructure, for roads, before sidewalks, before electricity or water systems and so on. First of all, we put the buildings. It's almost like a child is coming and spreading some buildings. We see that we have the same type. Sometimes it's shorter, sometimes it's longer, but basically it's the same. So it's like this kind of logic. We have always this kind of horizontal structures. Now, why horizontal? It's important because in a second I will show you really the paradigm shift. But it's always horizontal. First of all, as I said, it's cheaper to build, especially if you save on mechanical systems like elevators. But also, it's a faster way to expand, to occupy space. And as I said before, the main goal until today, okay, of the entire Zionist project is to occupy space. By the way, and now I'm going to say something that's a bit complicated, and so again, I will leave it for the questions if needed, but I will just kind of say it and without too much explanation, to expand, to occupy space, but not to determine the outline, the borders. It's not about determining borders or boundaries, quite the contrary. It's about postponing the decision of demarcating the line. It's about not deciding that this is me and this is my neighbor. This is my state and this is the state of the other. This is the boundary of this city or this neighborhood and this is another. The whole point is to blur the notion of a line, okay? So maybe we'll talk about it later because it's becoming really much more complicated, but we see it also here. So you don't see any outlines, okay? You don't see any formal logic. You don't see any form. It's against form, okay? It's not aformal. It's architectural. It's designed by architects, okay? And by other planners. And there is an idea behind this formlessness, but it's about formlessness, okay? So it's difficult to understand it because the block itself looks very much like a form. It's a very coherent kind of Sachlichkeit architecture. It's about the object. It's about a very coherent object. But the accumulation of many of these serial objects does not create any coherence, okay, in terms of the neighborhood, the city, or the entire state, the entire territory. Okay, it's very important to understand because this is the idea. So, but why is it possible? Why is it possible to create in such a generous way to take so much land? It's so inefficient, right? In terms of building. Why to build like that? Why should people walk so much? I don't know, and have so much open spaces, which are rarely green in this climate between the buildings. Why, first of all, and why is it possible? Because the state owns all the land. Because all the land is basically a confiscated land, and well, there's an argument if it's 95 or 97% owned by the state, but you can understand that basically, okay, literally all the land is state-owned or one of the state agencies. It could be the labor union, or it could be the Jewish agency, but it's basically state or the Jewish people's ownership. And when the land is yours, it has no market value, okay? And your idea is to expand as much as possible, to occupy as much land in a civilian way by building and by housing. It's always better to build horizontally, okay? So basically I would say also, it's not exact about Russia, but in general, when we see horizontal architecture, we know that it's a socialist or communist country because it's not only that the state owns the land, it owns all the means of production of architecture or of cities, of housing. So all the companies, the building companies and all the material companies and so on are all owned by the state or by large organizations, okay? It's not, there's no private market. So basically, when we see horizontality, we know that it goes left. Of course, when we see verticality, we know where it goes, and I'll show you in a second. Okay. I know it's very simple, but it's very easy to memorize. Okay. And Israel becomes really kind of in the 50s and 60s. It's considered worldwide as a center of a huge architectural experiment, especially in the field of housing. And basically, people from all over the world are coming to Israel to learn from the Israeli experience, especially in the field of housing, and especially so-called developing countries or countries that just gained their own independence. They were decolonized. Most of the African countries were decolonized around 1960, and also in Asia, we see a lot of countries. So basically, Israel now is the center of wisdom in terms of modernist housing projects. And we see a lot of it. Just to mention it, and Israel now, once they finished to build the housing projects in Israel, during the late 60s, they begin to build in other countries, mainly in Africa. I'm now, for example, researching a lot of Israeli projects in Africa. This is what I'm doing these days. It's quite amazing to see the extent of such a small country kind of producing or selling this kind of knowledge elsewhere. But also, I would like to mention a few things. One is that not everything was just kind of generic, repetitive, arbitrary projects. There were also a lot of experiments, great experiments in creating new architectural typologies. And we're talking about the generation of about a very young generation of architects, basically people in their 30s now, who are really eager to do good architecture, a bit modernist or brutalist architecture. And here we see a very nice project in Beersheba in the desert, where they're trying to do some carpet or mat housing surrounded by kind of horizontal super blocks and some towers and public buildings. It's a very famous project that was built, quite beautiful. It looks like this. So there were a lot of experiments or this kind of step housing types, just to show you that not everything was generic. These were experiments in doing climatic architecture, in finding the proper ventilation directions and shading and so on. A lot of these experiments were done in deserts or this kind of things. This is beautiful, for example, beautiful project, housing project near Tel Aviv by Tzvi Hecker. It's an architect who's still alive in Berlin, very famous kind of avant-garde architect. So there were groups of people who were reacting to this generic national project with more idiosyncratic experiments in architecture. So there is a lot of that as well. Or this kind of, this was built actually, again, in very hot climate. This was built, now it's about to be destroyed. It's in Jerusalem. It actually looks quite nice, but it's quite horrible. There's very thin walls and kind of prefab, so it doesn't work really. But a lot of these experiments, and of course the most famous is this one, again by Tzvi Hecker. I don't know if you have ever seen this. Now ultra-Orthodox people are living in it. It's really miserable because nothing is straight inside. So imagine the interior space, and it's very difficult to live in these things. But they were built. So there was also this kind of edge, this kind of a radical edge, which was at the margins of the national project. Okay. Now, this is how things look today. And again, we don't have enough time. Actually, I'm not sure how I'm doing with time. Can you?
We're a little behind our time, so if you could maybe wrap up a little bit and then come.
Okay, so I begin to wrap up. I'll do it very quickly, and then okay. So basically, there is a very as quick as the 50s and 60s, the Israeli project rose, with all these forces of immigrants coming and this kind of political imagination and motivation to actually build this project, this state. Just as quickly during the 70s, beginning the late 60s, it begins to disintegrate. the socialist welfare state is being gradually, but quite quickly, during the 70s, replaced by a new kind of liberal, and now we call it neoliberal, capitalist, right-wing regimes, states, which actually we have them until today. It's basically the same with ups and downs, but basically it's since the 70s until today, basically it's kind of a right-wing regime. So if all the first half of the century and the 50s and 60s were all kind of Labour Party, socialist leadership, now it's all right-wing, what we call Likud Party, and so on. And they begin, of course, to privatize things, and they don't give up the lands. They don't privatize the land so quickly, but they do privatize the entire housing industry. So the state is no more involved in housing. So if until the end of the 60s, almost all the housing is state housing, is done by the state or its organs, now, okay, almost nothing is done by the state, and it's all private market. And when we're talking about private market, of course, and it needs no explanation, of course, it immediately goes from horizontal to vertical, because what you want to do is to really to maximize profit or to multiply as much as you can the lot area that you have. Okay, to subdivide the land as much as possible, right? To subdivide the cake, and to build as high as you can in order to maximize your profit, and all with the name of densification. If the word before was spread out, now the word is densification. You know, supposedly to create better cities, but what you see is not much of a better city. It's really all kind of vertical towers. Again, the street that we talked about, that they so willingly got rid of before, is now destroyed for other reasons, because the tower has no continuous ground floor as well. So this is the kind of architecture that we see today in Israel. More and more like that. So it's going towards Dubai or something like that, I guess. And of course, the better Israel will do economically, the more it will look like that. And one more thing, just and I'll conclude very briefly this presentation. The idea of the rural is still there, but it's now used against itself. Okay, so if originally at least it had some kind of an ideology, a productivist ideology, so the Israelis or the Jews should work the land and should be connected to the land and produce things. So it was still an idea of agriculture and ecology and environment and so on. Nowadays, it serves a totally different idea, and the idea is of occupation and basically building the new settlements in the Palestinian areas, what we call behind the green line. These are maps. The blue ones are Jewish confiscated lands within Palestinian territories. So you see that we're trying to subdivide the possibility for a continuous territorial space for Palestine. And it looks like this. Basically, they take over the hilltops and create what the scholar Eyal Weizmann calls cul-de-sac settlements, or we call it sometimes balloon settlements. So there is a road, and in the end of the road, there's the settlement, and that's the end of it. It doesn't connect to any kind of system. It's overlooking the landscape and the Palestinian villages around it. Look how much road and infrastructure you need for small settlement, and it goes on and on. There are dozens, actually now hundreds of those built in the last decades. Some of them are small, few hundreds of people. Some of them are larger. They're kind of small cities, but this is what it is. It's all, again, one design, one gesture. It's also repetitive, generic, but with the kind of the look of a countryside kind of housing, in order now to replace the socialist sort of egalitarian generic project with what they call now quality of life. So now there is a everyone owns a piece of courtyard or a piece of land. It has a pitched red roof. And this is how it may look when it's more urban or like this. And I will end with this idea of the pastoral. Don't be mistaken. This pastoral image is extremely violent. It's extremely explosive. And it's about a very bloody war battle on this territory. I do not know what will be the end of this battle. It will not be good. What I do know is that architecture and urbanism is served here as a weapon in this, the main weapon in this warfare on territory. Okay, now it's time for to open up for questions.
Thank you, Tzvi. Thank you so much for this very, deep and thorough analysis of the architectural and housing policy in Israel. And even though, you were saying that it's a short history, it's still very, very complex with many nuances. And I think that many things that we kind of see and take for granted, you explained in a very direct and clear way. And some things, I know this was a very kind of systematic, very well-structured presentation. It was very clear, and thank you. Many things were very eye-opening and interesting. I wanted to come back to this idea of violence in architecture, because actually Anya and I were, discussing this topic for quite a while. And we were talking a lot about the strain of violence in architecture that's, so deeply embedded into its structures that we rarely see it unless something happens. So we often take it for granted because the system itself, especially the state system, is often built this way that we are not supposed to see this violence, because many architectural processes are being presented also through various propagandistic ways as beneficial ones for people, for residents, and if in case with Israel and Palestine, this is erasure of Palestinian villages. In the Soviet Union, that was the whole process of, demolishing villages and wooden houses and private houses and putting in that territories huge complexes. That was, of course, explained by the idea that the cities are expanding and people will get their apartments. But in that construction boom, many people also lost their own wooden houses. And for instance, in Critical Mass, we have a project about that, and one family that lost its house in this sort of, construction boom, when the state indeed thinks that all the territory belongs to the state, and the state is the one to decide what to do with the land, and how to also, through land grabbing, through kind of territory manipulation, how to control people's lives. So I think that's always a very kind of, a very complex process of how things are organized here. And I was wondering about the ethical, maybe role of an architect, and how morally and ethically an architect is, diving into processes and projects that are leading to violence, or have this violent strain into them. I wanted to show very quickly a short piece from a work by Israeli artist Nir Evron, where he addresses the situation and the kind of architectural perspective when it comes to building camps for detention camps for refugees at the Egyptian border, refugees from Sudan and Eritrea, who are kept in this detention centers. So this short video, I'm just going to demonstrate my screen. So he talks to the architect who is engaged in many state projects, and he talks to him about role of an architect in kind of questionable projects. And the dialogue is all performed by Nir. So because the architect didn't want to vocalize this question, this issue. So it's just a narrative and the landscape behind it.
אני תוהה ביחס לתפקידו של האדריכל בעיצוב החברה. אתה קם ועונה. לאדריכלים יש בדרך כלל אגו גדול. הם מרגישים שהם הולכים מטר מעל הקרקע. אבל אדריכל טוב הוא חלק מתזמורת, שבה לכל אחד יש את התפקיד שלו, אותו הוא צריך לבצע. עליך להיות צנוע, ולא להתעסק באידיאלים או בבניית מצבה גדולה לעצמך. אתה מוסיף. תראה, באים אליי כי יודעים שאני יכול להפוך X ל-Y בזמן הקצר ביותר האפשרי. זה התפקיד של האדריכל. לבסוף, אני מעלה את עניין הקשר הסבוך בין אדריכלות, פוליטיקה והון פרטי. אתה משיב. אדריכל לא צריך לבדוק את המדיניות של ממשלה שאני ואתה בחרנו. לממשלה יש מדיניות שמתבטאת גם דרך פרויקטים שצריך להקים. שם אני נכנס לתמונה. אדריכלות תמיד הייתה קשורה לכסף גדול וכוח פוליטי. אבל אין לך מה לחשוב על זה יותר מדי. שמע לי. אם בחרת לעסוק באומנות, עסוק באומנות. השאר את הפוליטיקה לפוליטיקאים.
I think that of course this is the big question, and artists are very good in really highlighting really the main issues, the important issues, and the important issue here is ethical. There's a big question: what is the role of architects in morally unstable or morally problematic situations? Do we architects, say we, collaborate with the system, with the political system, sometimes with the military system? What are our red lines? Where do we stop? Where do we say no? Now, it sounds very easy when the questions are very clear. For example, me and a lot of architects of my generation or younger or more or less, let's say me and my friends or my colleagues will not build in these Jewish settlements in the Palestinian areas, okay? We will not do all these camps, detention camps and so on. This is very clear, this is very easy. Where to draw the line. Certain things, which seems to me, and maybe to others as well, as crimes, simply stated, as things that should not be done anywhere, and specific not in Israel or in Palestine, that of course we say no. Even if a lot of the work, a lot of the commissions are there. You know that there is a school of architecture there in the Jewish settlements in the West Bank. This is the first of its kind anywhere. In occupied territories, you build a school, so you basically raise new kind of generation of architects who will build these settlements. Now, all these settlements that I show you, this will kind of pastoral settings, this is a lot of work for architects, and you don't know who are the architects. If you are an architect, would you not want in your website to publish this beautiful town that you just designed, the whole town? This is kind of a once in a lifetime project for me, for example, to do, if I would do something like that, right? It's a whole town that you design. But nobody knows who designed it because nobody really publishes in his website that he did it. And the government, of course, it's all kind of state-initiated or government-initiated projects, right? The government, of course, will not say anything about the agents of not only architects, it's a lot of other people, engineers and so on. But you don't know who these people are. In my book, in the last chapter of my book, basically my scholarship, my research ends before, so because I deal mostly with the 16th up to the end of the 60s and so on. But my friend and colleague El Weizmann is working on this period, on the latest decades on the architecture of occupation. So I didn't want in my book to repeat it, but I did want to do one research to try to find out who are the people accountable, who are the architects accountable for these designs. You have dozens, if not hundreds, of these settlements. Each one has an architect, a master planner, and then architects of the buildings. You know, everything is designed, but who are these people? So we did a whole kind of research, and I just put these images and the names of the people who did the design. Now, I cannot be sued because, you know, I just give them respect for designing these amazing projects, right? But they should be accountable. And there were some surprises. Some are architects that I don't know who they are. They're kind of, you know, marginal figures, but some of them were quite famous architects. And I guess also the architect that Nir Vaughan is interviewing, I know who is one of them, okay? Some of them are well-known architects, but they just don't talk about it. So this kind of silence about these things, people don't take responsibility for doing that. If you want to do this, say, okay, this is what I do, this is what I believe. Okay, I believe that this is a part of the state of Israel, fine. Okay, you can argue with it, but at least it's in the open. But if you begin to hide these things, it means that people are a bit uncomfortable or ashamed of this kind of work. Now, this goes, so it's, for me, it's quite clear that certain things you don't do, but there are other cases that are not so clear. For example, the project that I showed here in this lecture, the housing project of the 50s and 60s, where entire new towns were built and huge housing stocks were built in no time. Now, as I said, all the local architects basically participated in this, including the best of architects, because it did take a lot of expertise and commitment to do this kind of work. Basically, for me, ethically also, the most important work of architects is to do good housing. This is the most basic, this is the bread and butter, but this is also the most challenging and the most important thing. It so happened that my office, we're doing museums, but I don't think that museums are the most important. I think that really to do good housing is really the most challenging and ethically the most important things to do. But what happens, as it was in this case, when you participate in a state project where you realize that it's coercive, that the state forces this project both on the landscape, on the site, and on the people. People were not choosing to live in these places. They were basically brought from the boats or from whatever, the planes that, you know, immigrants or refugees, Jewish, basically refugees were coming from other places. First they were in these temporary camps, and then they were moved to these housing projects without anyone asking them, because in these out-of-the-way towns in the desert, there was no employment at first, or not at first, for decades, there was no employment. Some of these people came from totally different environments, they didn't want to work there. So they were basically put there, they were forced to be there. So would you as an architect participate in this or not? A lot of the anger in Israel, a lot of the resentment, and a lot of the reason for the political turnabout from left to right, basically, or from a welfare state to right-wing state, was because of that, because of what this idea of inhabiting the periphery, okay, that I explained for ideological and strategic reasons. This was not done by the people who were well-to-do. This was done by forcing basically the weaker people to be there. It was not that different from camps, okay? So maybe there were some good intentions, but this was not a winning project. People not moving they were not pioneers like the older generation of the people in the communes. There were people who wanted to live where they can find a job, where they maybe find a family member, where they can have a chance to survive, not in desert towns, which until today, by the way, are very, very weak, and they are called second Israel. So there was the first Israel in the end, in the center, in the bourgeois, in Tel Aviv and so on in Jerusalem, and there was in the periphery all around. this ideological periphery, the periphery of the plan that I showed you of dispersing the population, which until today is called Second Israel. And this Second Israel, until today, hates the Labour Party and the socialists, and they will vote no matter what to the right, even if they screw them. And of course, the right-wing government screwed them. Why they do that? Because they build every new towns in the settlements in the West Bank, and they forget about them. And by building new towns instead of investing the money in the old new towns, okay, they really create a greater gap between the immigrants of the 50s and 60s who are still there in the desert and the people who moved to the West Bank with this new kind of villas or people, private homes, and they don't live in these housing blocks. So the difference between the housing blocks and the red roof settlements tells you all the story of the left and right in Israel, the story of the first waves of immigrants who are still, but fucked up there and have no chance to get out of there. And the people who get all these tax incentives nowadays by the government to live in the West Bank for political reasons, okay, to prevent a Palestinian territorial continuity. So, and again, the ethical question is, where are we architects and where are we teachers of architecture? What do we teach our students at schools? Should you take part of this or not? Is architecture political or not? And the first thing that we say to our students, at least me, is that architecture is extremely political. It's first of all political and ideological. Now, you can argue. You can be on this side or on the other side, but you cannot say that it's not political. And you cannot say that you're not accountable, that somebody else, it's politicians who are taking the decisions. Yes, maybe they're taking the decisions, but you are enabling them to do this. It was architects. It was not Ben-Gurion who did this plan. Maybe he wanted this plan, but it was architects who actually designed it in the 50s and the 60s and until today. So anyway, yes, it's the ethical question is at the center of all this.
I have a question. Well, thank you very much, Zvi, for this very comprehensive description about. I mean, I like very much the connections between politics and architecture, and yes, it is an extremely political field. And I think that my question would be connected very much about the question of bodies, because question of human bodies and non-human bodies in this part of a relatively short history, which started from Zionist movement towards the foundation of Israel as a state and to contemporary time, because I think we've seen lots of images of buildings, of landscape. There is, and it's not only about Israel, but I think in all big political projects, the image of a human, of individual, of a body is very much like missing. And so in your presentation, you were talking about bodies as a tool for expanding territories and also leave those borders open, because I think only architectural buildings, they wouldn't play this role if they wouldn't be inhabited by bodies, right? Like, but by human bodies. Or filling the territory with people in order to justify this territory, to expand and justify the foundation of the new state as well. And of course, all this construction of the new towns, like 13 towns on a small territory of Israel, of course, affected very much the ecological landscape, the life of nature as well. So what is would be interesting to connect your presentation together with particular stories or witnesses or active agents, actually, of people that went through these events, went through this transformation of the state of Israel. Maybe you can, maybe that not necessarily was your intention during your presentation, but it would be interesting if you come up with some references where we can like zoom in into particular individual experiences.
There is a lot of this kind of research and work in the social sciences and the humanities in Israel. There's a whole new generation of scholars who are excellent, and they're doing a lot of things. Some of it's quite horrible because, I don't know, they get into things like, well, you don't want to hear about it, I don't know, now there's a huge controversy and something a very painful story that some of the veteran European Jews were somehow, I don't know how to say it even, kidnapping whatever children from people from other communities, weaker people, who were in these temporary camps, for example. So if kids were sick, they were taken to hospitals and then died. And then after years, it was discovered that they were given to people who had no children and so on. So there are all kinds of horrible stories, but there is a lot of sociological and narratives now about the situations that I'm telling you from an architecture perspective. A lot. I don't feel that I'm the expert on this, and also I don't feel that I can contribute much on this because there's so much good scholarship on that from other people. And believe it or not, but what I just described to you, when I started to do this research, there was nothing about it. There was no book, there was no study, there was no exhibition about it. And I started to do this research for an exhibition that was in the year 2000 at the Tel Aviv Museum of Art. So it all started with an exhibition, which was actually my PhD for Princeton. So it was kind of this story. I needed money to continue my research, so I didn't offer the museum an exhibition. And this is how I paid for the writing. And suddenly it became a big thing in Israel. But it was not known because, as I told you, architecture was taken for granted, as if it just happened, it was a time of emergency. There was no knowledge, no scholarship, no good architects. They didn't know what they were doing, and this is what came up, seriously. And then when I started to work on it and presented it in a different way, similar to what I presented today, the whole local discourse changed, and especially about the central role of architecture in this nation building process. And the central role means that, yes, there are some heroic parts of it, and there were some amazing moments of great architecture and a lot of usefulness and so on. So for a while, Israel was considered sort of the wunderkind of architecture in the world. This is serious. If you look at the architecture magazines in the 50s and 60s, you see almost in every issue something about Israel, because there were a lot of, basically it was a laboratory, a human social laboratory, and there was a lot of experimentation. But there were also some downsides to all this, and somebody has to discuss it in a more critical way. So today there is of course, people, both architects and artists, as you see Nir and others, who are doing great work on this. But just let me just mention that you're talking about other bodies, or animals, for example. There is now
like representatives of living nature,
living nature.
Yeah.
So there is an amazing group, good friends of mine or former students of mine, who were supposed to present in the Israeli pavilion at the Venice Biennale, which is for us sort of an important occasion. We don't have too many. So the Venice Biennale, Architecture Biennale, is very important. And the Israeli Pavilion for quite a while has very good exhibitions. And the people who curate and do the research for the coming one, which was supposed to be last year, but it will be in May now. The topic is land of milk and honey, and it's about this image of plenitude and about the flora and fauna. And it's an amazing research. So I really recommend you to invite them because they're doing research through animals. For example, they compare the story of the goat, which was the black goat, the local goat, and then they imported white goat. And through this story of the move from the black goat to the white goat, they tell the story of the place, for example, and bats and cows and so on. It's an amazing research. It's really first of its kind that I know, at least locally in Israel and Palestine. So look up to them. And so there is a new kind or a new generation of scholars and artists who are doing amazing stuff. But don't assume that this is the overall situation in Israel. The architectural market, so to speak, is still very, very blind or ignorant to all this because they don't want to know, because they want to work. They want more commissions. Israel is still growing very quickly, unlike the situation in most countries in Europe or anywhere. So there is a lot of work. Everybody is happy. When people are happy, they don't become too critical. So there is kind of a critical milieu in the academy and in the art world and in museums and maybe some periodicals, but most of the professional market is just doing kind of neoliberal buildings, towers, and nobody cares for anything.
Yeah, and even with that, I think the housing situation in Israel is very critical because there is so much demand for housing. It's very expensive. It's been expensive for many years now. It's hardly anyone can afford buying an apartment without, I don't know.
Exactly. Exactly.
And the people, the population is growing and growing, and their access to housing is getting more and more limited.
Absolutely. My daughters, who are now in their early 30s, they have no chance to buy an apartment of their own, which was not a situation for my generation, and certainly not for the generation of my parents, who had all this, state-sponsored project. So yes, maybe the apartments were small, maybe urbanistically it was very arbitrary and problematic, but at least there was some kind of a responsibility of the state to house or to give decent housing to and affordable to the people. Everybody had a permanent, house, a roof, and now it's not the situation at all. There are power groups within the society, like the settlements, or other groups of interest, like the Orthodox Jews. They have their politicians who take care of them and build towns only for them, which is a huge problem. But this is what it is. And for other parts, like for the Arabs within the state of Israel, the Palestinians were citizens of the state, the situation is very, very bad.
Yeah. We also have one question from the audience. If we go back to kibbutzim, so the question is, if I think you spoke a little bit about it, but maybe you could develop it a bit. Are there any examples of villages or mashav or kibbutz returning to the city? Maybe it was the same principles of this collective architectural approach. And maybe some bits of bigger cities like Tel Aviv were built on this principles of, close community within the city, if there's something like that.
The answer is yes. There were, first of all, as I said before, there was already in the 30s, there were estates of workers' housing that were operating in a collectivist way. And not everybody could be a member there. But if you accept the rules of the place, and if you are in the right party, and usually if you're well connected, to the bureaucrats, to the apparatchiks, yes, you can be there. The problem, of course, was that there were sort of enclaves within the city, so they were working very well for themselves, for the residents, but they're separated from the others, from the city. So it's a bit problematic because the relationship between these in the 19th century they were called phalansteres, these communal urban blocks, was that their interface with the city was a bit problematic. Okay, they were very good for their own people, okay, providing kind of mutual help and so on. And between themselves, because there were several of them, there was kind of a network of those. So yes, there were experiments in communal living in the city already in the 30s, and I would say that all along there was not much, but there was always what we call urban kibbutz. Urban kibbutz usually is initiative of a group of young people. Maybe they were together in the youth movement, maybe they were together in the military or in high school, and they decide to have a commune basically, and they would take over one or two or three of these 50s and 60s blocks, maybe now deserted, or they will re-inhabit or reuse them, and will have their own commune there. So a lot of these kind of ideas of shared spaces or collective spaces now are popular anywhere in the world. You see it a lot in Germany, in Scandinavia, and you see it a lot in Israel. I wouldn't say a lot, it's always marginal, but enough cases like that. And of course, you will see more and more like that, especially now with this kind of very fragile economy. So a lot of kind of new ideas of local economy and mutual help and sharing and so on, and getting rid of kind of private property and consuming less and kind of healthier or more natural living. All these ideas, yes, you can find in the city now, in various cities, but I wouldn't say that it's kind of, it's certainly not the mainstream, it's not certainly not significant. It's at the margins of things, yes. And it's mainly young people.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't have still a distinct architecture. It's mainly inhabiting existing structures. Whereas in the original situation, in the beginning of the century, they really were trying to invent an architecture, a particular architecture for this. Because if you have to do, a dining hall or a library or a school in the rural for all the community, it's a building type that does not exist. You have to invent it. And also they have special ideas of the relationship between the architecture and the landscape. They wanted, for example, people when they sit and eat, that all the landscape is open to them. So they had to invent kind of, again, horizontal windows, panoramic windows. But for this, structurally, you have to be very smart because you cannot put the structure at the periphery. So it's all, it was a period of innovation because it was new. They were making up. Okay, they were really, I use the word fabricate because it's a sort of fabrication. And they wanted these settlements, both the moshav and the kibbutz, to look very organic and very natural, right? So a lot of effort was put in the landscaping. The most important person in the kibbutz, I always say, is the gardener. He's the person who's terrorizing everybody because he's in charge of the environment, of the way it feels, the way it looks. He's really always the strong person in a kibbutz. And there's no hierarchy. This is the idea. There's no leader. There's no so in this non-hierarchical structure, people who take care of the environment suddenly become very important. Okay, but it's all, again, it's all superficial, a lot of superficial, artificial. It's all an artifice. It's all a design. It's nothing there is natural. Okay, it's not really nature. It's a pastoral design. And of course, agriculture itself. Now we know nowadays, we can say many good things about agriculture. We need food, But agriculture is also an industry. It's industrial. Ecologically, it's a problem. Okay, I don't know what's the solution. Okay, what's best, but it's a problem. Agriculture in America, for example, huge fields of monoculture, of corn and so on, is one of the biggest ecological problems that we're facing now. So the many issues that are involved in design, in architecture, nowadays at least we are more sensitive, everybody's more sensitive to issues of environment and architecture. But yet again, it doesn't mean that we are sensitive also to human issues. The settlers, for example, in the West Bank, who are on the hilltops, if you talk to them, it's amazing. They know every flower and every insect. They feel very much connected to the nature around them, but they're totally hostile to the people around them. Okay, so it's a crazy situation.
Yeah, Anna, we can't hear you.
There is still a lot of work to be done in terms of architecture and actually understanding what is sustainable urban living, really, and kind of how to really reduce this reproduction of violence in architecture, how to think within architectural and political process still about individuals and about living nature and environment. And I think what you've shared today with us is a very unique case. I think Israel is a unique case of this design project, recent actually, like a very recent design political project within the history, and still yet trying to appropriate all the knowledge from the previous architectural development or from previous political project, but still kind of making mistakes. And so it seems like we are running in the circle.
Let me try to wrap up to close with my very opening statement about the rural, about the countryside. Interestingly enough, one of the main kind of polemical issues today is the countryside, not only because I'm just kidding. Rem Koolhaas was doing his exhibition, very controversial exhibition at the Guggenheim in New York, which is called Countryside, the Future. Okay. Now, when Rem Koolhaas is doing it, of course, everybody's talking about it and everybody's arguing about it. And I think that his timing was very good, except for the corona, but his timing was very interesting.
When was it? It's
still on. It was open just before the outbreak of the pandemic, and then it was closed, and then they reopened, but it's still there. I think, not for long, but it's still there. It's the entire Guggenheim. And a Countryside, the Future, it's called. Now, it's amazing that Rem Koolhaas was doing so much work on urban situations and now going and researching the countryside. But for Israel and for the Zionist project, this is always the story. And today, especially now with the pandemic, it's a big question, what is the proper form of living? People want to move out of cities because they feel that the city is almost a trap, that it's a problem. So the countryside is maybe an option. Now, the countryside was always the preferred option for Zionism. And we already have the infrastructure of a lot of rural settlements, a lot of small towns. So maybe Israel is prepared for the future in terms of its infrastructure. So maybe now it's time to go back to the 30s and to the 50s and to rethink the early Zionist project, because what's happening with the vertical, what I showed you, this kind of vertical privatized neoliberal project, is that it densifies the cities to such an extent that it's such an overload on the infrastructures, on roads, on water systems, on schools and so on, that it becomes totally impossible, because the rates of growth, both of the Jewish and the Arab Palestinian population, is is really great. It's nothing like Europe. We are, I don't know, 3.5 or something like that. It's really growing very fast. And it is said that in 2040 or something like that, we will be 15 million Jews and more or less 15 million Arabs in this very small territory. That's 30 million in this territory. This is by far the densest place in the world. So this is crazy. If it's going there, the question is, what is the proper structure? Should we crowd more and more in cities and go higher and higher? Or should we live in this old infrastructure that we have of rural and small urban and small cities? A big question, I think.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it. I wanted to go to that direction about actually thinking of decentralizing the urban living and live elsewhere, and why everyone wants to live in big cities and pay a huge rent and be all stressed for the 30, 40 years of their life about mortgage and losing jobs. Why not just to have a quieter life, more sustainable, less stressful? But I think Rem Koolhaas can talk about it being Dutch, because the Netherlands,
especially if we have electrical cars or non-polluting cars.
Exactly, because it's possible in the Netherlands to think this way, because in every small village the infrastructure is basically similar to the one which is in Amsterdam or in the central part of the country. But for instance, in Russia it's basically impossible, because everyone goes to bigger cities because of job. Economical force is
He talks also about Russia.
Force.
He talks also about Russia in the exhibition.
Okay. Yeah, and it's it's just. I wouldn't mind to live in a smaller city and have my own gallery and work. Create this kind of art community, but it's basically almost impossible to do this in the country where all money goes into the central places. So it's just, you really have to reshuffle economical flow, money flow, but it's very difficult if you're not part of the high top of politics.
But maybe things are changing. Maybe the pendulum is now going the other way. There were throughout the 20th century, there were several waves of people leaving the cities and going to suburbs or to the countryside.
Yeah.
It's not the first time. And maybe we're now beginning to see another kind of swing from the city outside.
Yes,
it's still a very expensive project, to leave the city, because we see, lots of New Yorkers or Londoners living the city, but these are only the rich people who can afford having an extra house in the countryside, which is completely, equipped for living there whole year round, and who can afford not being connected to the city, and I think this is a very far way for us to go. And, in Russia, all big Russian cities are surrounded by this, mansions of very rich Russians who chose the countryside a while ago already. And they just work in the city, maybe occasionally, but most of the time they spend outside the city. So I think this division that we're kind of, witnessing during the pandemic, with the poor becoming poor and the rich becoming richer, is also geographically wise going to change. So the poor are going to stay in the city, and the rich are just going to, start slowly living and create this ghettoed, gated communities outside the city. So there will be this island, like in your diagram with the 6, villages. Maybe something similar will happen around big cities again. This process started a while ago, and it's, I think, just going to expand more.
We will keep exploring, and we will keep inviting professionals and experts on that to discuss about this. And we would like to really thank you, Tzvi, for your input into our archive of projects we so far collected and recorded, and for us, it's of course very important to look at different geographies and different points of view from and conversate with people from different knowledge field of knowledge, and also like zoom into like very individual experiences, because only personal stories are giving you all insights into this bigger political movement.
And I'm happy we had a practicing architecture, which
Yeah.
is also great, because the kind of, nuanced perspective that you were giving is so much charged with your professional approach. And that was extremely interesting, because we've had sociologists and artists and also another architect. But I think it was a very interesting conversation in terms of logic of architecture and how architectural projects are being created, how they're being developed, what are we going to do with already existing infrastructure, something that we didn't touch upon, but that would take us another hour, I guess. We're already far kind of behind our time limit. So Tzvi, thanks so much again.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful, very interesting. I also want to announce our next conversation, and I hope many of you will be interested. So on March 25th, we're meeting documentary filmmaker Chet Friedrichs, who is the author of the film The Myth of Prut-Igo, a very famous case of a modernist complex in St. Louis, which was built in the 50s, and again with very good intentions to put people of color there, to put their to give access to housing to people with kind of maybe a weaker social background. And through years, it became a very marginalized part of the city and got demolished. So Chet traces the history of this project, and he also talked to some of the residents. So it's introspective into this case from different points of entry. So we also look forward to talking to him and to seeing bits of the film that he's going to show. And that's in 2 weeks from now. So we have our sessions every 2 weeks. A while ago, we just slightly broke this contingency, but we're gonna resume it again. So in 2 weeks, we're gonna be hopefully seeing you all here at 5 o'clock European time. So thanks so much again, everyone, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
I enjoyed it.